HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Natural Magic, Emily Dickinson, Charles Darwin, and the Dawn of Modern Science by Renée Bergland. Read by Teri Schnaubelt. Preface. An Orchis Heart. The summer of 1858 was a hard one. Epidemics of diphtheria and scarlet fever spread across Britain and the United States. In Massachusetts, Emily Dickinson's mother was ill and needed constant care. Dickinson spent hours nursing her, keeping her company, worrying. Late at night, while the household rested, she wrote with surprising focus. The pressures of the sickbed gave new intensity to her literary experiments. She started 2 projects, a series of master documents that discussed love and literature using the vocabularies of natural philosophy, history, and theology, and another project that included careful copies of her poems sewn together into booklets. Both were private, closely guarded secrets. She did not intend to publish. Thousands of miles away, in England, 3 of Charles Darwin's children were also sick. As his youngest son's fever worsened, an unexpected letter arrived from the East Indies. Until that summer, Darwin had kept his theory of natural selection private, as he worked painstakingly to substantiate it. If he continued to avoid making a public declaration, another man, Alfred Russel Wallace, the man who had sent the letter, would get sole credit for the theory. Darwin, distracted by the illness in his household, found it almost impossible to think. His friends advised him to publish the ideas he had long held close. They arranged the simultaneous relief of 2 brief papers outlining Darwin's and Wallace's ideas. Darwin did not participate much in the publication. His son, Charles Waring Darwin, died of scarlet fever in late June. Despite his grief, when the summer ended, Darwin started writing On the Origin of Species. Darwin and Dickinson never met. When they embarked on their greatest works, neither was aware of the other. Though they vaguely knew that many families around the world were going through similar trials during the season of epidemics, neither had any idea of the parallels between their ideas. Dickinson had studied the natural sciences in college. In the years afterward, she would become familiar with Darwin's work, but in 1858, she had no thoughts of Darwin. At night, she listened to the music of crickets and peeping frogs. When she could get away, she walked out into the meadows, forests, and wetlands of Amherst for comfort. More often, she worked in the garden, staying within earshot of her mother. She tended the flowers expertly, as her mother had taught her. Dickinson's booklet of poems, her fascicle, started with a botanical observation. The poet fit her verses to the paper, arranging them as she had arranged dried plant specimens in an album, her herbarium, as a student. She wrote the first line carefully in rusty black ink. The gentian weaves her fringes. Dickinson was describing a brilliant blue wildflower that opens in sunlight and clasps its finely lashed petals tight when cold weather threatens. Her fascicle blossomed with flowers and buzzed with pollinators. The first sheet mentioned 6 different species of plants and described them with a naturalist's precision. A rose was a sepal, petal, and a thorn, interacting with a pollinating bee. Now in her late 20s, Dickinson was more serious about her fascicle than about any of her school projects. This was a more ambitious endeavor. An herbarium could never have contained the plants and animals she wanted to describe, much less the philosophical speculations and moments of surprising emotional intensity she hoped to bring together. Though her poems were metaphorical blossoms, she would not display them. She wanted to hold her wild ideas close. The gentian poem concluded, My departing blossoms obviate parade. For now, her work required privacy. Though the circumstances were ideal for creating her experimental mix of poetry, empirical observation, and philosophy, the climate was not right for exposing her work to the world. As far as we know, she did not show her fascicle to anyone. In private, she could explore her own longings and beliefs. On the first page, she wrote a brief prayer, or parody of prayer. "In the name of the bee, and of the butterfly, and of the breeze, amen." In these lines, the poet invoked the material world, physically real animals and air currents, in place of religious figures. "In the name of the bee" demonstrates that Dickinson did not separate poetry from philosophy or religion, much less from the natural sciences. The bee, the butterfly, and the breeze were not mere metaphors for her. Dickinson believed that the non-human natural world was rich with meaning. At the bottom of the first sheet of paper, the poet was left with just an inch or two of blank space. She added 2 lines that brightened the page with imagined pink. "To him who keeps an orchis heart, the swamps are pink with June." Many years afterward, Dickinson's family would place a pink orchid, Cypripedium acol, a pink lady slipper, above her heart before she was buried. But in 1858, Dickinson was not worried about dying. Instead, she feared that she would be forever mired in caring for her mother and doing the household labor that her mother had always done. She found housework unbearably dull. In the dismal swamp of chores, her late-night literary experiments helped her keep an orchis heart. After her mother recovered in the autumn, Dickinson no longer needed to stay so close to home. But the course of her life had changed over the summer. Dickinson had learned that she could thrive in isolation, keeping odd hours, dividing her time between the garden and her manuscripts. Putting pen to paper filled her with excitement. Her vocation had become insistently clear. She would be a poet. That summer marked a similar turning point for Charles Darwin. In 1858 and 1859, in the face of his grief over his son and his fear of public controversy, he worked furiously to complete his book on natural selection. Like Dickinson, Darwin, beset by care and family illness, looked to flowers and to the natural world for comfort. After their son's death, Charles and his wife Emma tried to console each other. They often went out to a spot near their house that they called the Orchis Bank. Now known as the Down Bank Reserve, it still hosts 11 species of orchids. Scholars believe that the entangled bank Darwin described in the conclusion to On the Origin of Species was probably the Orchis Bank where he and his family liked to walk. Of course, Darwin had no idea that a woman in Massachusetts had written a poem about a man who managed to keep an orchis heart. Yet he filled his pages with the bright colors and remarkably vibrant, intricately interwoven relationships of the flowers, insects, worms, and other species he had found entangled together on the Orchis Bank. Darwin published On the Origin of Species in December 1859. In the years that followed, he would often be at the center of public debate, subjected to bitter denunciations and passionate advocacy. At times, his allies' misguided defenses of his ideas would be as excruciating as the condemnations. Darwin would try again and again to explain that the adaptation and change at the heart of natural selection could offer consolation and inspire hope. Darwin had hoped his ideas would be important in scientific circles, but he had never dreamed they would have such a widespread impact. Indeed, he was startled by his sudden scientific fame. As it turned out, few aspects of life or death remained untouched by Darwin's thought. His ideas were quickly woven into the fabric of the modern world. Across the Atlantic, Dickinson's response to Darwin helped her write the poetry that speaks to us today. Meanwhile, Darwin took refuge in his greenhouse, working with orchids. When he asked an Irish botanist to send him a very large shipment of orchids, he explained, "I fear I am very unreasonable, but this subject is a passion with me." Darwin showed the world his orchis heart in 1862 with the publication of his book On the Various Contrivances by which British and Foreign Orchids are Fertilized by Insects and on the Good Effects of Intercrossing. In a private letter to his good friend, the botanist Joseph Hooker, he begged for orchid pods and the mosses that hosted them. Remember orchid pods, I have a passion to grow the seeds. For love of heaven favor my madness, and have some lichens or mosses scraped off and sent me. I am like a gambler, and love a wild experiment. Dickinson loved a wild experiment just as much as Darwin, who was one generation ahead of her. Darwin's remarkable ideas about the natural world would influence her thought profoundly. She did not have the same impact on Darwin as he had on her. In fact, since she published almost nothing during her lifetime, her circle of influence was very small until after her death. But being in the next generation also conferred some benefits. Able to read Darwin, consider his ideas at leisure, and record her responses for posterity, Dickinson usually got the last word. In this account, I have taken the liberty of giving her the first word, too. For me, this book started with the puzzling realization that many of Dickinson's poems seemed profoundly Darwinian. Although she never mentioned Darwin by name in her poems, she rarely mentioned anyone by name in her poetry, so this absence did not rule him out of her important influences. She did name Darwin in 2 letters, which confirmed that she knew about his work. Still, there was not much to go on. She returned again and again to the topics that fascinated Darwin, but was that enough to demonstrate that she was responding to his thought? In the Name of the Bee could serve as an invocation for On the Origin of Species, yet Dickinson wrote these early poems before Darwin published On the Origin of Species. I wondered if it was just a striking coincidence, like the parallels between Darwin's theory of natural selection and the very similar theory developed by Alfred Russel Wallace at the same time. Did Dickinson write about Darwinian ideas simply because she was his contemporary? Did her writings seem to apply to Darwin merely because she was a great poet whose writings were almost universally applicable? Both explorations are valid, as far as they go, but neither goes far enough. There is a stronger connection between Dickinson and Darwin than the proximity of history or the universality of literature. They both understood natural science and the natural world in ways that seem strange and somewhat surprising in the 21st century. Their 19th century attitudes to nature and the study of it are so different from ours that when we trace their stories, a vanished world begins to emerge. The more I consider these figures together, the more I feel their world and my world come alive. Darwin and Dickinson illuminate each other. By reading them together, we can start to understand the interconnected relationships that animated 19th century poetry and science. Dickinson's works would not become public until long after both Darwin's and Dickinson's deaths. Yet although she kept her writing private, her lines form a fitting epigraph for a book about 2 people who loved botany and natural philosophy. Today, we remember them as towering figures among the greatest of the 19th century's poets and scientists. In 1858, however, these professional identities were still emerging. Dickinson and Darwin had not yet become cultural giants. They divided their time between caring for their families and writing, and they shared a curious passion for orchids. For them, science was full of magic. Unknown to each other, they both believed in the bee, the butterfly, and the breeze, and they trusted that, to him who keeps an orchis heart, the swamps are pink with June. Natural Magic. Introduction. An Enchanted World. Charles Darwin did not call himself a scientist. When he was young, it was not possible. The word scientist was not invented until 1833, when Darwin reached his 20s. Before then, people who studied the natural world were known as naturalists and natural philosophers. Darwin's shipmates on HMS Beagle thought of him as the ship's philosopher. They called him Philos. The nickname did not imply that Darwin was a lofty thinker, prone to idle reveries or flights of fancy. At the time, natural philosophy was a surprisingly active, physical pursuit. When the word scientist replaced natural philosopher, the shift marked a change in the way people thought about studying the natural world. It was more than mere semantics. In the decades before scientist was coined, there was no clear separation between the arts and the sciences. After scientist was proposed as a parallel to artist, these realms began to divide. Until then, romantic poets and philosophers, who were often one and the same, tended to think of pursuits that we would now call artistic, writing poems, sketching landscapes, making botanical drawings, as empirical investigations into the natural world. At the same time, their idea of philosophy was often very close to what we now think of as natural science. Natural philosophers conducted experiments. They collected specimens of animals, plants, and minerals and exchanged them with others. They anatomized, classified, and dissected, breaking rocks open, pulling flowers apart, cutting frogs into pieces. Philosophers were people who got their hands dirty. In Frankenstein, her 1818 novel about a deranged natural philosopher, Mary Shelley described philosophers as men whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible. Although the fictional Victor Frankenstein would become the prototype for mad scientists in thousands of subsequent novels and films, Shelley never described him as a scientist. At the time, years before the word existed, such crucible-wielding, microscope-peering, dirty-handed dabblers were known instead as philosophers. Decades after the word scientist was coined, Charles Darwin and Victor Frankenstein would come to stand for two sides of the 19th century scientist in the popular imagination. The fictional Frankenstein would represent the horrifying danger of interfering with the natural order of things, while Darwin's systematic, secular approach to the natural world would be associated with the dry logic of disenchantment. On the one hand, supernatural horror. On the other, a wholly rationalist world so drained of emotional or spiritual significance that it inspired another type of horror. Scientists would become disturbing cultural figures either way, whether they were too close to magic or too far removed from it. Both extremes point toward a second remarkable shift that happened around the same time. Just as natural philosophers were transformed into scientists, natural magic was banished from serious conversation. In the course of the 19th century, scientific objectivity replaced more subjective, emotional approaches to the natural world. Science distanced itself from wonder. The German sociologist Max Weber would describe this process as the disenchanting of the world. As Weber defined it, the central principle of disenchantment was that there are no mysterious, incalculable forces intervening in our lives, but instead all things, in theory, can be mastered through calculation. Weber held that modern thinkers had replaced the old sense of mystery with a surprisingly unsubstantiated belief in the principle that humans could, theoretically, have mastery over every aspect of nature. Charles Darwin's approach to the natural world was unquestionably secular and systematic. He was not a mad scientist like Victor Frankenstein, much less an evil wizard. His attitude was closer to the rationalization and intellectualization Max Weber would later describe. However, it would be wrong-headed to imagine him as a great disenchanter who wanted to master the universe. Mastery was alien to him. Darwin challenged human supremacy and stressed kinship among living beings. The humility of his works shocked some of his contemporaries. Throughout his life, Darwin remained fascinated and energized by the mysteries of the natural world. He never lost his sense of enchantment. In fact, the scholar George Levine has argued that Darwin is best understood as a secular enchanter. Though Darwin witnessed, and even participated in, the separation of science from philosophy and poetry, he regretted the divide. In his autobiography, Darwin recalled, "Up to the age of 30 or beyond it, poetry of many kinds, such as the works of Milton, Gray, Byron, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley, gave me great pleasure, and even as a schoolboy I took intense delight in Shakespeare, especially in the historical plays. But in 1839, his 30th year, Darwin published his first book, The Voyage of the Beagle, an account of his 5-year journey around the world as a naturalist. In honor of his work, Darwin was made a Fellow of the Royal Society. After he was inducted into the highest echelon of science, he narrowed his scope and renounced other pursuits. In later years, he would come to feel that his turn away from poetry was a curious and lamentable loss. In a letter to the botanist Joseph Hooker, written when he was nearly 60, Darwin remarked, "I am a withered leaf for every subject except science." Darwin was not as much of a withered leaf as he feared or as others imagined. Yet, to his chagrin, Darwin became a shorthand way of referring to a version of materialism that saw the world as wholly disenchanted, meaningless, and dispiriting. Darwin's own view was richer. On the Origin of Species celebrated the grandeur of the natural world, with its endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful. That sense of aesthetic appreciation and open-ended wonder imbued all his works, including the books on corals, barnacles, and worms. In The Descent of Man, 1874, Darwin concluded that appreciation of the beautiful shaped sexual selection for many species. In Darwin's thought, beauty was central. He believed that evolution hinged on aesthetics. The impact of his work, however, was beyond his control. Darwin would watch helplessly as poetry, beauty, and magic drained away from science. The story of how science and religion became opposed to each other during the 19th century has often been told. In many accounts, Charles Darwin plays the role of the great Victorian scientist whose work opened the floodgates of secularization. In this book, however, I will unfold a different narrative. Darwin will begin as an aspiring natural philosopher, born in an age when poets were philosophers and philosophers poets, as Darwin's biographer Janet Brown describes it. Together, poetry and philosophy played the role that science plays today, and magic had a place in serious thought. During Darwin's lifetime, science and scientists would come to be imagined in opposition to poetry, philosophy, and magic, as well as religion, but Darwin would remain skeptical of the hardening boundaries between science and other ways of understanding the natural world. My account will explore how magic invisibly persisted for Darwin and his closest intellectual kin, infusing their sense of 19th century science with infinite possibility. We will begin in the years before magic seemed to disappear, the years when poetry and natural philosophy were inseparable. To gain a sense of the approaches to nature that nourished Darwin's thinking, we will consider the poet-philosophers who shaped his world, his grandfather Erasmus Darwin, and the circle of romantics and radicals that included Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Mary Shelley. But although Charles Darwin's romantic roots reached deep, he was no romantic. By 1859, when he published On the Origin of Species, the world of his grandfathers had vanished. In his own time, when poetry was often separated from science, the poet who best captured the relationships between science, religion, and magic was Emily Dickinson. Born in Amherst, Massachusetts, where girls were expected to study the natural sciences, Dickinson was extraordinarily well-positioned to respond to Darwin's ideas. After studying at Mount Holyoke, Dickinson moved back to Amherst and lived in her family home on the edge of the Amherst College campus. She and her family were among the intellectual and cultural elite of the United States. Her father was a U.S. congressman. The family was instrumental in establishing Amherst College. Dickinson was 29 years old when On the Origin of Species was published. She was an accomplished poet, but she usually kept her writing private. One of the few people who had the chance to read her poetry was her mentor, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who shared Dickinson's knowledge of and interest in the natural world. This common interest bonded them together. In one early letter to him, she proclaimed, I know the butterfly and the lizard and the orchis. Are not those your countrymen?" She knew that Higginson was as interested in natural science as he was in poetry. When Dickinson started writing to him, Higginson was one of the most prominent literary Darwinians in the United States. He frequently quoted Darwin. His 1860 lecture at the Concord Lyceum a few weeks after On the Origin of Species was published used quotations from Darwin's newest book to argue against slavery. He framed his 1862 essay on the Life of Birds with a quotation from The Voyage of the Beagle. "We do not steadily bear in mind," says Darwin, with a noble scientific humility, "how profoundly ignorant we are of the condition of existence of every animal." Although it was somewhat unusual to cite Darwin in the mid-19th century, what is most striking about this mention is that Higginson praised him for noble scientific humility. He understood that Darwin did not pretend to be a master of nature. Few others were as admiring or as perceptive. Higginson would eventually provide the closest personal link between Darwin and Dickinson. They had other social connections, but Higginson was the strongest tie. He was one of the only friends invited to visit Dickinson at home in western Massachusetts in the poet's later years. He was also acquainted with Darwin and visited him twice in Kent. On his second visit, in 1878, Higginson would stay overnight at Darwin's home. The social ties between Darwin and Dickinson are not particularly surprising. In cultural terms, 19th-century Massachusetts was practically a British colony. Britain and New England were closely connected at the time, though everything in New England tended to be on a smaller scale. New England's yeoman farmers were very different from Britain's aristocratic landowners, but the differences between the emerging professional classes were much less significant. Darwin and Dickinson were born into similar social echelons. Darwin's father was a doctor, Dickinson's was a lawyer. They both moved in highly educated, socially progressive circles. While Dickinson's family had been instrumental in the founding of Amherst College, Darwin's family patronized a wide variety of institutions. Darwin's grandfathers were both lunar men, founders of the Lunar Society of Birmingham. 10 members of the Darwin-Wedgwood clan were fellows of the Royal Society. Darwin's fortune came partly from the industrial pottery established by his Wedgwood grandfather, and partly from his family investments in railroad companies and other ventures. Dickinson's Norcross grandfather was a canny investor who left substantial property to the poet's mother. Her father was an enthusiastic proponent of the railroad and the telegraph, who made significant investments to bring the new technologies to Amherst. Thus, Darwin and Dickinson were heirs of industrialization, fortunate scions of 19th-century capitalism. They were both wealthy enough to be able to avoid the usual obligations. Darwin did not need to find a paying job. Dickinson did not need to marry. Instead, both could stay home and spend their time focused diligently on observing the natural world and writing about it. Their financial independence allowed them to concentrate full-time on writing. Darwin cared deeply about literature. He was a writer as well as a naturalist. Dickinson's interest in nature was equally profound. She was a naturalist as well as a poet. Darwin sailed around the world but never visited North America. After he returned from his great voyage and established himself in the village of Down, he became somewhat reclusive. Dickinson never left the United States. In her 20s, she traveled south along the eastern seaboard to Washington, D.C., but as she grew older, she stayed closer and closer to home. From the 1850s to the 1880s, Darwin and Dickinson lived surprisingly similar lives in similar places. The connections between Darwin and Dickinson went much deeper than their overlapping friendships and their similar circumstances. Caught in the middle of the great disenchantment that Weber would document, both Darwin and Dickinson grappled with the massive cultural changes wrought by modern science. Over their careers, each would wrestle with the implications of dividing the study of nature from philosophy and poetry. Was it possible that the material world was entirely separate from any higher ideals? Was the universe random, neither good nor bad, but somehow outside of ethics? Was the cosmos meaningless? Through their influential works, both addressed these questions. They advanced scientific ways of thinking while continuing to insist that the natural world was rich with mystery. Today, Dickinson and Darwin are remembered very differently, most obviously in relation to gender and nationality.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?